Hey folks, welcome back. This is Andy with the Poor Proles Almanac. You can find us on Spotify, iTunes, and wherever you get your podcasts. In today's episode, we speak with Farmer Rishi, a farmer, educator, and consultant based in Los Angeles, working in the field of regeneration. We chat a bit about the idea of urban agriculture and some of its shortfalls, and what are better options to work with folks in trying to empower them to grow their own food. Additionally, we chat a bit about our own perspectives and some of the baggage that comes with being a first-generation immigrant here in the United States and getting into something like farming. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this conversation. It was a great chat, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the feedback from you. Farmer Rishi, thanks so much for taking some time to chat with us. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into education and agriculture?
Yeah, thank you, Andy, for having me on. It's been definitely a bit of a long journey to get to where I am today. In college, I was a computer science major and just decided while I was studying that it wasn't what I really wanted to do with my life. And I wanted to kind of engage with something that was felt a little more tangible and a little more like embodied, I guess. And so while I was in school, I got involved with gardening, and then I spent some time on a farm in India during and after school. And when I moved back home, after I had graduated, I moved back in with my parents, and I knew I wanted to do something farming related. And I was living in the suburbs of Los Angeles with my parents, and they kind of gave me the go ahead to start converting their yard into like an urban garden or a small, urban farm. And it just kind of came, the education part of it. I think I've just always been someone who likes to help others learn. And so it just, very kind of organically came about that, okay, I'm starting a garden here and I'd love to help other people learn about gardening, learn about plants and soil as well. And so I started teaching classes, giving workshops, doing tours. And definitely the educational component of my work has evolved beyond just gardening practices now, but that was the start of it.
Great. I'm kind of curious with your background. Is your family from India?
Yeah, my parents originally from India.
My parents are also immigrants as well. And I personally think it's really interesting to see, I think, the relationship that folks from other parts of the world have with things like farming versus here in the US, where it's almost been kind of, I guess you could say, like disconnected from the way we live. I was curious if you thought that relationship at all kind of impacted how they reacted to you being like, hey, I want to do this thing. And I know it's kind of weird here, but what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because, India is so stratified in terms of like, class, and that relates to farming so directly over there as well. So my family and most, Indian immigrants who've come here didn't come from a very agricultural background. Most Indians that have immigrated to America would have been considered upper caste and probably didn't have too much relationship directly to farming. And that's the same for my family. My recent ancestry is more like a landowning class and not a actually hands in the soil, working the fields class. There's definitely like a stigma among the Indian immigrant community here against farming and, against doing anything that's manual labor. That's not something, I would say that most kids like me who've grown up here, their parents would be pretty disappointed to hear that their kid was going into farming. Maybe one of the differences in my family is that my grandparents and my mom have always been gardeners since my grandparents moved here in the 1970s. They took up gardening as a hobby, and it's something that they really enjoy. It wasn't super foreign. It was something that my mom actually really enjoyed doing and was supportive of me kind of taking this up as a profession somewhat. My grandparents, on the other hand, have definitely been very hesitant to maybe be supportive.
It's just a phase.
Yeah. I don't know. It's not really clear and simple. I don't know. I think you get different levels of support from different people in my family.
Yeah, it's like I said, my parents are from Italy and they were farmers. My dad wasn't, but my grandparents were. And they were always very close to the land, but at the same time, it was like there's a reason why we left southern Italy where we farmed. Like don't do what we did. And so there's like this really weird dichotomy of both respect for the land and the practice, but also being like, but not for you.
Right.
I think all this kind of ties back into this idea of one of the common themes that you talk about, which is our relationship with the landscape and with what you might call quote unquote nature.
Mm.
I really want to talk about this idea of like naturalism. And
Right.
I think it's a really interesting term that's evolved really quickly in the last probably couple decades as it's been kind of commodified.
Mm.
And it's really interesting because with this term, you see it both on the left and the right, meaning different things. And this idea of like going back to the land, like what we're talking about, where we're a couple generations out from these types of relationships with food and things like that. But there's definitely some issues going on as people are trying to reclaim that relationship with nature and food and things like that. And I know it's something you've talked about a bit in the past about this idea of, nature's always right isn't really accurate, or it's a little bit more complicated that. So I'll punt it to you and let you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, this has been something that took me a really long time to really understand and like kind of see beyond the framework that was handed to me. I don't even mean that in like just in the terms of gardening and farming, but it's like this is the idea of nature is really, really embedded into, what you might call like Western colonial society. And I started to really like question this, even this whole concept a couple of years ago when something about this concept was just not making sense to me anymore. Because, we hear we are not separate from nature, we are nature. And then on the other hand, people would be saying things like, and this is what happens in nature, and then I started to feel like, wait, something is not making sense here about how we're framing our place on this planet and our role on this planet. Something is just feeling really, really off for me. And I think it's interesting, like even what you were just saying, like the back to the land movement. I mean, even in the framing of that, right? Like the back to the land, like, okay, when did you leave land? Like, like, what do you mean back to the land? Where are you right now that isn't on land?
Yeah.
And so it's just this idea that the idea of nature is just such a very, very strange concept once you really start to examine. One of the main scientific and medical journals in the world is called Nature. And the framing of that is kind of that science observes and studies nature. And nature, again, is this separate outside, structure or being or spirit, depending on, who you are or what your beliefs are maybe. But, it's this outside structure that humans are not a part of, but interact with, but mostly in a negative, destructive way, and nature exists out there, and it's this perfect, perfect thing that we're always striving to do best by, but we can't really do that well by it because we're not part of it, we don't understand it, And so I've really just, I've come to the point where I just don't accept this idea. I don't accept the idea of nature. And I published a piece about this a couple of months ago I just titled "Nature Does Not Exist." And I've been through my writing kind of exploring what it means to us as people to say nature does not exist, and how this concept of nature really like is very confusing, it's very muddying, it's like puts us in a very like foggy, difficult to see place. And I really, really feel that deconstructing nature and moving away from a human versus nature, human separate from nature paradigm is key to reestablishing ourselves as caretakers or caregivers of this planet and finding healing for ourselves.
Yeah, I think we have a bad habit of conflating the fact that we have so much impact on ecology, meaning that we're not a part of it. So one term that I was jokingly using was that we're like fire beavers. So like beavers, use water and they'll flood out an entire area and completely change the ecosystem. And we kind of do, or historically have done the same thing, except with fire, where we've used fire to manage entire ecosystems.
Right.
And we, instead of humans in nature versus humans outside of nature, what does it mean to be in nature? To think about more. I think the problem with the term nature is that it oversimplifies a really complicated relationship, and it's not really appropriate for a lot of the ways we're thinking of using the term. And I think that's where people get really frustrated, is the language is just so limiting. And I think that also feeds into some of these issues of how the term is, I guess, weaponized by various organizations, political groups, and so on, and how we interact. And like you were talking about, like colonization and this idea of like constructing in our image what we think nature should look like. And I think for like a vast portion of people right now that are very concerned about things that are going on the planet, both ecologically and in terms of economics, that vision is like a back to land homesteader colonialism, which is really problematic in a lot of different ways, especially here in the United States. So I'm interested, I guess, as you've been kind of unpacking this understanding of nature, or the lack thereof nature, is this something that you see? I mean, especially I think like with vaccines in the last year or two, do you have this weaponizing of nature? I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I very honestly, I would say that nature is an idea founded in racist and white supremacist ideals. And I say that because, again, it's this idea of one, nature being outside, but two, nature also being this perfect ideal. And that idea, that the concept of the perfect ideal is very tied to, almost like the concept of the ideal person, the ideal blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white-skinned person. And how in this, in the racialized conception, it's like your personal distance from blonde hair, blue-eyed, white skin is your distance from perfection. And in nature, it's like your distance from, the wild forest where people don't exist, and the animals and the birds and the, soil and the fungi live in some perfect balance. It's like this idealized, even just the idea that there is this ideal place, this ideal conception, is essentially a racist idea. We're constantly judging ourselves against something that doesn't exist. The beautiful, perfect nature that people write about in, these, romantic poems, like, it's not there. The forest, when you walk into a forest that's been well cared for, it's beautiful. Many times forests can be beautiful. Many times forests can be peaceful. Many times forests can be refuges. And, one of the things that really hit me, I was traveling after college, and I went to this forest monastery. I think it was in Thailand. And when I was reading about it, they were saying that, this monastery inhabits one of the few remaining primeval forests in Thailand, meaning, it had never been cut down. And when I walked in there, that place was, can I curse here?
Yeah.
Okay. That place was fucking terrifying. Like, being in that forest was extremely terrifying. It was almost, I went there midday. It was like evening inside. And it was so dark because the canopy was so heavy. And there's so many animals like running around up in the canopy, down on the floor, so there was this very loud noise, like the just like the noise level was really, really loud. And then there was like some screaming, monkeys or something, like, hey, hey, like, so I'm just in this like dark forest, it's me and my friend, and it's loud, and like, it's very, I mean, part of it being scary is probably also that we're not, we weren't used to being in a space like that. But yeah, so what I'm trying to say is forests can be beautiful, forests can be scary, forests can be terrifying places, forests can be very violent places. And so I think when we fall into this conception of this separate, perfect, humanless space, we are forgetting, like a lot of what that these places actually are, and and we're kind of enforcing our perception onto the space instead of actually being there and being present and being fully accepting of, the world that we live in.
And I think that plays out a bit in our landscaping here as well. It shouldn't always look pretty, and that's okay. So I want to tie this back into the actual experiences you've had farming. So if you could talk a little bit about how all of this has kind of played back into your education and some of the actual agricultural stuff you're doing.
Mm-hmm. I think the reason that my work has tended to, I've kind of been in like this borderlands of farming for so long, or almost exclusively, being farming in the urban world, specifically in Los Angeles. And so a lot of these ideas, like we were saying earlier, like back to the land, which was this idea that if you live in the city and you wanted to participate in the healing of soil and plants, you needed to leave and go back to the land, right? And so for me as an urban farmer, I live on that border, that constructed border. And so that's allowed me to kind of deconstruct the idea of that border even existing. And so, I started with my parents' yard, and their house is in the suburbs of LA. And, in the suburbs, you're supposed to have a lawn, and you're supposed to have these bushes that are trimmed into boxes. And, you're supposed to, just like, your house is supposed to look like every other house on the street. And you go to the grocery store and you buy your food, and you let the water from your property drain onto the street, and then you buy water from the aqueduct to water your lawn. And so to convert that space and to see really like how easy it was to bring abundance into that space, especially in an urban context where we have so-called waste just like floating around all over the urban environment, right? Like there's just food scraps, cardboard, wood chips, coffee grounds, juice pulp. There's so much energy. There's so much like food for people, food for soil, food for plants. People are paying to get rid of this. How easy it is to feed the garden when the city is actually so full of food. And so very quickly in urban garden, you can take a soil that's been neglected, abused, forgotten, and just bring it to a state of abundance that, and honestly, like in rural areas, it's actually difficult to get to these kind of states of soil health that you can get to pretty easily in urban areas, because there's just so much, and there's just sheer quantities of material.
Yeah, and I'll say, like, I think part of that is you have byproducts of humans, and you have more people in cities. So by definition, no one's cutting down trees and shipping them someplace where people aren't annoyed by that tree, or that tree doesn't fall in someone's car or whatever. So that gives you that access, the food byproducts. So I use a lot of food waste from food pantries that otherwise would get tossed after it's gone through the food pantry and no one wants it. And it'll be, shredded carrots and this and that. And whatever it is goes to the chickens. And it's not pretty. And I'm sure that's not ideal for what my neighbors would like, but it converts into compost really quickly. And those are resources that we have available that otherwise are just going quite literally to waste. Hey, thanks for tuning in to the Poor Proles Almanac. This is Andy, reminding you that if you're looking for more content outside of the scope of the podcast, or sources, recommended readings, or ways to support us, you can find that at poorproles.com. Further, we've expanded our delivery into video content on our YouTube channel, where we're able to show step-by-step how to do many of the processes that we talk about within the podcast. We have also started a Twitch channel where we platform various folks on skills from DIY mushroom production to the various methods to keep land out of the hands of developers. Again, all this can be found at poorproles.com, and we look forward to seeing you over there.
One of the things that I realized was that all of these ideas of how you build an ecosystem or how you function within an ecosystem, they don't disappear because I live in a city. And I think actually this term concrete jungle is so apt, right? Because the city is, when I compare my experience when I go to downtown LA to when I was in that primeval forest in Thailand, it's kind of very similar. There's a lot of smells, there's a lot of noises. It's very dark. I feel very fearful that, in the jungle, some animal is gonna, tiger's gonna come out and kill me. And in the urban space, like, I'm looking around because there's these mechanic tigers flying by at 40 miles an hour, and I'm afraid that I'm going to die from those. Like, I really think it's an urban jungle, and I think we have to understand cities as ecosystems, or as gardens, and really the same principles apply. So again, that's part of what what for me, being in an urban and suburban area, I started to understand, like, no, this is not separate. There is no part of this earth that is not earth. That's something I tell people, like, there's no part that when we have the idea of nature in our mind, then we say, oh, that's over there, nature, and this over here is not nature. And, I tell people, nature for me does not exist. And two, there is no part of this earth that is not earth. There's no part of this. Just because you're in a city doesn't mean you've escaped the laws of earth or the systems of earth. Like, we're still here. You're still living on land. You are literally made of earth. Even, your concrete houses and your asphalt roads and your plastics, like, it's still all earth. There's no part of this planet that isn't earth. The principles still apply.
That whole argument is really interesting because of the implications it has on our relationship. And again, to circle back to what I brought up before, the weaponization that's happened of the term like natural products and nature, and like you said, going back to nature. So with that in mind, do you feel a responsibility in challenging this concept of nature and how it's been weaponized? Like, does that politics work into your agriculture and the things that you teach?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the weaponization of nature is pretty obvious. Just if you look even at, like, kind of right-wing politics, one of the examples that always comes up to my mind is when right-wing groups were protesting against gay marriage or trying to make, being gay was illegal for so long, right? And what's one of the slogans, right? Like, homosexual sex is against nature. We hear that kind of language this is against nature. This is against nature. Like, if it was against nature, it would not be possible. Like, if it defied the laws of nature, you couldn't, or, supposedly laws of nature, the laws of the universe. If it defies the laws of the universe, you wouldn't be able to do it, right? And so I think that kind of weaponization is so obvious. I mean, even think about, like, anti-miscegenation laws, right? What did they say? They said sex between Black person and a white person is unnatural. It should not happen. It's our job to enforce that this sex does not happen, or this marriage does not happen. So for me, it really, like, this is not something new. This is a concept that is really, again, seated in white supremacy. We've kind of, like, over the years been understanding, like, oh, okay, like, this part, a white man and a Black woman can get married, and that's not against nature. And a man can have sex, and that's not against nature. Like, we've been slowly, like, removing items from the list of what's against nature, but we still haven't removed the idea that there is something against nature. I see that so much in the environmental movement. I see that so much in the permaculture movement. And when we have people saying things like, in nature, the soil is never uncovered, and I'm walking around like, the soil's uncovered all over the place. Like, what are you talking about? Like,
Yeah, it is. And I think it points to, like, to go back to what you were talking about, like, this idea of, like, an envisionment of what nature looks like. And cancer is natural. Nature isn't by definition a good thing in terms of it, like, being a positive force on whether it's the life in the soil or us when we may have cancer or something like that, and, like, this term, like, nature's always right, gets tossed around a lot. That's, I think, disingenuous at best and dangerous and manipulative at worst.
Yeah, and we see it so much right now with, people's ideas in relation to the vaccine. Vaccine hesitancy is primarily coming from, or not, maybe not primarily, but, like, a large portion of vaccine hesitancy is coming from the like natural health movements, the permaculture world, even the ecological and environmental world, where people have this idea of what should happen, right? And also the idea that man's work is some kind of manipulation that's going against, higher order framework or something, and that our hands are inherently toxic. That's something I've written about, just saying like, we have to understand, we have to live in our context. Like even when it comes to food, people who advocate for healthy food and organic food and regeneratively grown food, like, I'm not totally, I think just part of that is, it's just very convoluted, to tell someone who lives in an urban area who's low income or no income or in debt and has health problems, and you're going to tell them, you know what you need to do? You need to spend triple the amount of money that you're spending on food right now to buy organic food. It's just like, that's not helpful to that person in that context. And also you're going to end up kind of shifting the blame to them for their issues, for their health issues. Like you don't value yourself enough. You're not spending enough money on food. Like, okay, the person doesn't have any money to spend on food. It's not their fault that not able to afford that food. So why don't we talk about what's healthy for people in their context? And so what's healthy for someone? What can you do? What's within your power? What are the resources available to you so that you can actually affect your health in a positive way? And why does that need to be focused on eating organic or eating regenerative? It might come down to someone deciding what's the healthiest option for them that they can afford at McDonald's, and that's okay. That's just, It's just a reality of their situation. We can't be judgmental of their reality. We can only do the best in our reality. And so much more of the problems that we face are so like structural, societal. I wish that as a society we would spend more time and energy on fixing structures than than honestly like blaming people for their problems.
Yeah. I worked for a nonprofit for a while and managed some greenhouses, and we would do a lot of projects on like bringing those foods into communities, urban communities and disenfranchised communities. And that's just not enough in a lot of ways. Even if you're making a lot of assumptions and saying like, here's, a head of lettuce and some celery and some beets or whatever it might be that you grew, and just being like, here's some food, go eat healthy. And it's like, well, that's not a solution. And first off, it's just a one-time thing. Second off, you're assuming they have the time to cook it and prepare it. Third, you're assuming they have the resources to cook it and prepare it. There's so many problems with that idea of like, well, if you go and just get the food, even if we bring the food to you, like somehow this is going to solve this systemic problem. Even if it's well-meaning, it's not helpful at best, and it's offensive at worst.
Yeah.
Like you said, you can't solve structural problems with like some little, meaningful or attempt to be meaningful effort to quote unquote teach someone how to eat right or whatever.
Right.
So how does that play into what you're doing?
I've been in this urban farming world for quite a while, and I see this issue, right? Like just exactly what you're saying, especially in the urban farming world. I mean, the recent kind of resurgence of urban farms has been with this idea that, grow food where people are hungry, right? And there's so many problems with that conception again, because, okay, grow food where people need it, right? Well, people are in urban areas, the land in urban areas, that's the most expensive land in the world. The water in urban areas, it's the most expensive water in the world. Paying people to work in urban areas. I mean, there's so many things financially going against you growing food in an urban area. It ends up being extremely expensive to grow this food. And then you want to give it away for free, right? And it's like, it just doesn't work. You usually end up having to be reliant on an outside source of funding. And then you're just at the whims of some philanthropic person or organization. And when you run out of funding, the farm closes. And I've seen that happen dozens and dozens and dozens of times over the last 10 years. And so what the work that we're trying to do at the organization that I'm involved with, Sarvodaya Institute. I'm the executive director and the founder. Our farm, the farm that we have in Pomona here in Los Angeles, we tried that model. For 3 years we operated a CSA. We grew, we tried to grow as much produce as possible every year for those 3 years. And we did, by that measure, we did incredibly well. I mean, we grew on like 1,500 square feet of actual bed space, I think. I could be wrong there. No, I think it's more like 5,000 square feet of actual bed space. We grew in the last year, we grew like 14,000 pounds of food.
Yeah, that's a lot.
and so, by that measure, we were very successful. But then, at the end of these 3 years, I was looking back and I was examining, okay, like what was our impact, right? And what was the amount of effort that we had to put in? And the amount of effort was insane. I mean, had like multiple people working many long hours to grow this amount of food. And while that's commendable, what's the impact of that food? And that amount of food, while it seems significant, when you look at the population that you're sitting among, then it's so minuscule. It's a very limiting way of impacting the community that's around you, because you can hardly feed 0.01% of the population of the city that you're in.
Yeah, that's like maybe you fed a small apartment building for a year.
Maybe.
Out of a whole city. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, we haven't even talked about like the issues that you were mentioning about like how much of this produce is actually getting cooked and eaten, how much of it is actually going to people that need it. And so I just realized like, this is not the way for us to be impactful. And I started to really think about and consider the experiences that I've had, running an urban farm. And so many people would come to the farm and tell me, this is a valuable place. In different ways, they would say, this is a really valuable place. This is a really valuable place. I really enjoy coming here. I really enjoy being here. And so that's when I started to really consider that input that I've been getting. Then we started to shift the whole framework of what our farm is and how we serve people and how we engage the community. And so the shift started to go towards, this is a really valuable place. This is a really valuable place. Okay, well, if this is a really valuable place, let's just try to let people enjoy the space. People enjoyed being in the farm, being in the garden, being among the trees, hearing the birds sing, watching the butterflies fly, seeing the flowers, smelling the flowers, tasting some of the produce, sure. But we started to shift towards, how can we give people the experience of being in a nurturing, embracing, beautiful space, rather than feeding them the food. Well, of course, there's going to be food grown in this space, but let's focus on just creating a beautiful space and then trying to engage the community so that as many people as possible from the local community can actually come here and be in the space in a nurturing way. And so now the focus of our organization is that. And so what we have is we're converting our farm away from like row crop produce production and towards just being a really very dynamic, beautiful, abundant, big food producing, bounteous garden where you can come and learn about gardening. You can come and take workshops with us. We do gardening workshops once a month. We have like various art and craft workshops, herbal workshops. We're trying to get a schedule of like meditation and like body movement, whether that's yoga, dance, like ecstatic dance, movement classes. We have about a third of our entire space is dedicated to being a nursery where we grow out plants that are mostly food and herbal plants that we know work well in our local region. So people come to us to get plants so they can get their garden started at home. And then, people just come and enjoy the space. We had 30 fruit trees planted on the farm before, but now that we're taking out most of the row crops, we're planting like 100 more fruit trees. We're putting in a pond. We're putting in a couple gathering spaces. So people will be able to come and just hang out, pick fruit, eat fresh fruit that you probably never had before. We let people use our space as a venue space. So we're doing like baby showers and birthday parties, and we have a Friendsgiving coming up. And so now it's like you see that the number of connections coming into our farm has grown exponentially because we can impact so many more people when we're just focused on impacting people by letting them come to the space.
Yeah, and giving them the authority to decide how they want to interact with that space.
Exactly. And what they want to take home and, what's valuable for them. And so now we're bringing in a lot more income with less effort. So now we have 4 paid staff on the farm where we used to have 1, and we're growing. We have 200 people who are donating to us regularly as members of our organization who want to continue to see us grow and continue to see our impact grow. And I'm seeing finally that we're coming to a model of what an urban farm can be that is impactful, that is engaging, that people want to support, and that financially I'm seeing a model that we can actually replicate and be more self-sustaining and not, we have no foundational support. We have no grant support. Primarily we have people who are donating to us on average of $8 a month. And we have about more than half of our income coming from our nursery. So we're creating a model that can actually grow itself.
Yeah, that's really cool. You said that you think this is a replicable model. Now, I'm really interested about the traditional urban farm you have worked. If you think there's a place for that type of work, or do you think that the model is just by definition not really something we should be thinking about or working on, but instead rethinking about how we can give people the authority to make those types of food decisions within those spaces?
Yeah, I think the kind of row crop production urban farm model, I would say that's, if there is a space for it, it's a very limited space, much more limited than what we currently imagine. One thing that's interesting is like cities fund public parks, and public parks are just lawns, cement, and, maybe like a baseball diamond. I think that there's so much space for the public and government to support a model like this, where as a community deciding that, we want a space like this and we want it to be publicly accessible. We want gardens and, urban forests. Like that should be a priority of the city, to create spaces of our cities, of our governments, to create spaces like this. Yeah, so I don't see the produce focused urban farm model continuing for very long, other than as, maybe an educational or experiential space.
Cool. Yeah, one of the things that I've always struggled with when I had been working similar to that type of work is the fact that a lot of the food you grow isn't really calorically dense. It feels like you're doing the side salad and you're never really addressing the main meal.
Yeah.
I've always had that kind of frustration with this. I was really interested to know what your thoughts were on it. Farmer Rishi, if people want to see or hear or check out any of your work, do you have social medias, website, anything like that?
Yeah, a couple things. If you want to get involved with what we do, I would encourage people to sign up for our membership at Sarvodaya Institute. So it's sarvodayainstitute.org. You can also follow us on Instagram at Sarvodaya Farms. And we have this membership program. We're doing a membership drive all the month of December this year. For $5 a month, you can sign up to support us. I do an online gardening lesson via Zoom for all of our members. And we have this online portal that you can join the lesson live or watch recordings. And then there's a couple of membership levels where you can see all the past recordings as well. We got like almost 15 lessons up there already now. if you want to support our work in that way, I'd appreciate it. You can follow me at Farmer Rishi. I also have a website with my writings, farmerrishi.com. And then the other project we didn't really get a chance to talk about is I'm the co-founder of a company called Healing Gardens. And what we're doing with that is we are helping urban gardens bring people into their spaces. So it's kind of like Airbnb-ish for urban gardens. So if you want to offer events or workshops or let people use your space as a venue, you can list it with us on Healing Gardens. We provide the insurance, the online listing, the transactions, the email communications, and that's just go to our website, healinggardens.co. And you can sign up, and if you want to look for a garden in your area, you can go there too and find a garden near you.
Farmer Rishi, thanks so much. This has been great.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
As always, if you enjoyed this episode, please give us a review on iTunes or go support us on Patreon. Until next time, this is Andy, and this is the Poor Proles Almanac.